What really happened to the Vikings? Chapter 1, Part 1. To understand what really happened to the Vikings, we first have to travel back to a time before anyone had ever heard their name. Long before they became famous as fearless warriors, the people of Scandinavia lived quiet and demanding lives surrounded by mountains, forests, deep fjords, and the cold waters of the North Sea. Their homeland was beautiful, but it was also one of the harshest places in Europe. The land offered little comfort. Winters were long and unforgiving, often lasting for many months. Snow covered the valleys, icy winds swept across the coast, and daylight almost disappeared during the darkest weeks of the year. Farming was difficult because only a small portion of the land was suitable for growing crops. Families depended on barley, oats, livestock, fishing, and hunting to survive. Every successful harvest meant another year of life, while a poor harvest could bring hunger to an entire community. The people who lived in what we now know as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were independent. There was no single king who ruled all of Scandinavia. Instead, countless local chieftains controlled small territories, each surrounded by loyal families and warriors. Power was earned through leadership, courage, and generosity, rather than inherited through large kingdoms. A respected leader protected his people, settled disputes, rewarded loyalty, and proved his strength whenever conflict arose. From an early age, boys learned how to handle an axe, a spear, and a shield. Hunting was not only a way to provide food, but also a lesson in survival. They grew up climbing rocky cliffs, rowing through dangerous waters, and enduring freezing temperatures that would have defeated many others. These experiences created people who were both physically strong and mentally resilient. The sea became their greatest teacher. While many civilizations feared the open ocean, the people of Scandinavia embraced it. Rivers and coastlines connected isolated villages more effectively than rough mountain paths ever could. Fishing boats slowly evolved into larger vessels capable of carrying both cargo and warriors. Generation after generation, skilled craftsmen improved their designs, learning how to build ships that were lighter, stronger, and faster than anything their neighbors possessed. These remarkable vessels would later become known as longships. Unlike the heavy ships used elsewhere in Europe, Viking longships were masterpieces of engineering. Their narrow shape allowed them to move quickly through open seas, while their shallow draft meant they could travel deep inland along rivers. A crew could sail across rough oceans one week and appear hundreds of miles inland the next, launching a surprise attack where no one expected them. This flexibility would become one of the greatest military advantages of the Viking Age. But superior ships alone do not explain why the Vikings suddenly began leaving their homeland. Historians believe several powerful forces came together during the 8th century. Scandinavia's population had grown steadily for generations. As more families competed for the same limited farmland, many younger sons inherited little or nothing. Opportunities became scarce. Some sought new land where they could build their own future, while others looked beyond the horizon in search of wealth that simply did not exist at home. Trade also played an important role. Scandinavian merchants had already established contacts across the Baltic Sea and beyond. They brought back stories about wealthy monasteries, prosperous towns, and kingdoms filled with silver, gold, and valuable goods. These stories spread quickly through coastal communities. For ambitious young warriors, the distant lands of Europe promised riches beyond imagination. Religion may have contributed as well. The Norse people believed in powerful gods such as Odin, Thor, and Freya. According to their traditions, bravery in battle brought honor, not only during life, but also after death. A warrior who fought courageously could hope to enter Valhalla, the great hall of Odin, where fallen heroes prepared for the final battle at the end of the world. Although everyday life was centered on farming and family, courage remained one of the highest virtues in Norse society. Yet the first Vikings were not simply bloodthirsty raiders. Many left home as traders, explorers, or settlers. They exchanged furs, amber, walrus ivory, iron, and handcrafted goods for silver, silk, spices, and other luxury items from distant civilizations. Trade routes stretched across Europe and even reached the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Scandinavian merchants returned with foreign coins, new ideas, and knowledge of lands few of their neighbors had ever seen. Everything changed in the year 793. On a small island off the northeast coast of England stood the monastery of Lindisfarne. It was one of the holiest Christian sites in Britain, known for its peaceful monks, beautiful manuscripts, and treasured relics. For generations, it had been a place devoted to prayer rather than war. No one imagined that it would become the starting point of a new chapter in European history. One summer morning, strange ships appeared on the horizon. Their sails caught the wind as they approached the shore with astonishing speed. The monks had little reason to fear visitors. Coastal communities regularly welcomed merchants and fishermen. But these newcomers carried shields, axes, and swords. Within moments, the peaceful silence was shattered. The attackers stormed the monastery, killing those who resisted and taking anything of value they could carry. Gold and silver ornaments disappeared into waiting ships. Sacred objects that had taken years to create were stripped from the church. Some monks were captured and sold into slavery, while others fled in terror. The raid lasted only a short time, but its impact echoed across Europe. To Christians living in the 8th century, the attack seemed almost unimaginable. A holy place believed to be protected by God had been violated by unknown warriors from the far north. Chroniclers described the event with fear and disbelief, recording terrifying signs in the sky and calling the raiders instruments of divine punishment. Whether the Vikings understood the symbolic importance of Lindisfarne is impossible to know. They were almost certainly motivated by opportunity rather than religion. Monasteries often contained great wealth, but had little military protection. From the perspective of experienced seafarers looking for valuable treasures, they were easy targets. The success of the raid spread quickly throughout Scandinavia. News traveled from village to village, carried by sailors returning home with silver, jewelry, and stories of astonishing victories. Young men who had never ventured beyond their local fjords suddenly realized that fortunes could be won across the sea. More expeditions followed. At first, they were small seasonal raids. Crews would leave in spring, strike vulnerable coastal settlements during the summer, and return home before winter. Few people could have predicted that these isolated attacks marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary eras in European history. Over the next 3 centuries, the Vikings would sail farther than almost anyone believed possible, founding settlements, conquering kingdoms, opening new trade routes, and changing the destiny of nations. The age of the Vikings had begun. Chapter 1, Part 2. The raid on Lindisfarne was only the beginning. In the years that followed, Viking ships appeared more frequently along the coastlines of Britain, Ireland, and the Frankish kingdom. At first, their attacks were small and unpredictable. A few ships would arrive without warning, strike quickly, and disappear before local armies could respond. Communities that had once felt safe behind the sea suddenly realized that the ocean had become a highway for invasion. The Vikings understood something that many rulers of Europe did not. Speed could be more valuable than numbers. Their long ships, allowed them to travel enormous distances in a remarkably short time. A fleet could cross the North Sea in just a few days, land almost anywhere along the coast, and even continue deep inland by following rivers. Because their ships required very little water beneath them, they could sail where larger vessels could not. This gave them an advantage that few enemies were prepared to counter. As the years passed, Viking raids became more organized. Experienced leaders commanded larger fleets, and successful warriors gained reputations that attracted even more followers. Raiding was no longer simply an opportunity for adventure. It became an organized way of gaining wealth, land, and influence. But the Vikings were changing. Many no longer wanted to return home after every expedition. Instead of taking treasure and leaving, they began settling in the lands they had once attacked. Ireland became home to several important Viking towns, including Dublin, which grew into one of the most important trading centers in the region. Across the North Sea, they established settlements throughout Scotland and on the islands surrounding Britain, where Norse culture remained strong for generations. England became one of their greatest ambitions. By the middle of the 9th century, Viking leaders realized that conquering land could be even more profitable than simple raids. In the year 865, a massive force, known today as the Great Heathen Army, arrived in England. Unlike earlier raiders, these warriors did not come merely to steal silver and sail away. They came to conquer. Kingdom after kingdom fell before them. Northumbria was overwhelmed. East Anglia soon followed. Mercia struggled to resist. Within only a few years, much of England had come under Viking control. Large areas became part of what historians now call the Danelaw, where Norse customs, language, and legal traditions shaped everyday life. Yet one kingdom refused to surrender. Wessex, ruled by King Alfred, faced repeated invasions. Alfred understood that defeating the Vikings required more than courage on the battlefield. He strengthened defensive fortifications, created fortified towns, improved roads for rapid communication, and developed a more effective military system that could respond quickly to Viking attacks. His strategy gradually changed the balance of power. Although the Vikings remained dangerous, they could no longer move through England without facing organized resistance. Alfred's victories earned him the title Alfred the Great, and his reforms helped preserve an independent English kingdom during one of its greatest crises. Even so, Viking influence continued to spread far beyond England. To the west, adventurous sailors pushed into the vast Atlantic Ocean. Around the year 870, Norse settlers reached Iceland, a remote volcanic island unlike anything they had ever seen. The land was harsh, but it offered something increasingly valuable: space. Families established farms, built communities, and created one of the world's oldest parliamentary assemblies, the Althing, where disputes were settled and laws were agreed upon. Not satisfied with Iceland, they continued farther west. According to Icelandic sagas, Eric the Red sailed beyond the known world after being exiled for violent disputes. Around 985, he reached an enormous frozen island that he named Greenland. Historians believe he deliberately chose an attractive name to encourage settlers to follow him. Surprisingly, the plan worked. Hundreds of Norse men and women crossed the dangerous ocean to establish new farming communities along Greenland's southern coast. One generation later, Eric's son, Leif Erikson, sailed even farther. During one of his voyages, he reached the shores of North America, nearly 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic. Archaeological discoveries at L'Anse aux Meadows in present-day Newfoundland have confirmed that Norse explorers truly reached the continent around the year 1000. Although their settlement lasted only a short time, it proved that Viking exploration had carried them farther west than any Europeans before them. Meanwhile, other Vikings looked east instead of west. Swedish traders and warriors traveled along the great rivers of Eastern Europe, using waterways that connected the Baltic Sea with the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. These journeys brought them into contact with the Slavic peoples, the Byzantine Empire, and the Islamic world. Along these trade routes, they exchanged furs, honey, wax, amber, and slaves for silver coins, silk, spices, and luxury goods from distant civilizations. Some of these Norse adventurers became known as the Varangians. They served as merchants, diplomats, and elite warriors. The Byzantine emperors valued their loyalty so highly that they created the famous Varangian Guard, an elite military unit composed largely of Scandinavian warriors. Armed with massive axes and renowned for their discipline, they became the personal bodyguards of the emperor himself. By the beginning of the 11th century, the Vikings had achieved something extraordinary. Their influence stretched from the icy shores of Greenland to the warm waters of the Mediterranean. They had founded cities, established trade routes across continents, ruled parts of England, settled distant islands, and even reached North America. Few civilizations of their time had explored such an enormous portion of the known world. To many people, it seemed as though nothing could stop them. But history was already beginning to change. The kingdoms of Europe were learning from every Viking attack. Kings strengthened their armies. Castles rose across the countryside. Coastal defenses improved. Christianity spread steadily through Scandinavia, bringing new beliefs and new political alliances. Without realizing it, the Vikings had reached the height of their power. The same qualities that had once made them unstoppable would soon become less effective in a rapidly changing world. The era of endless expansion was drawing to a close, and the forces that would eventually end the Viking Age were already beginning to take shape. Chapter 2, Part 1. Why the Vikings disappeared. By the beginning of the 11th century, the Vikings stood at the height of their influence. Their ships had crossed oceans, their warriors had defeated kings, and their merchants had connected distant civilizations through an enormous network of trade. For generations, Europe had lived with the constant fear that longships might appear on the horizon at any moment. Yet something had begun to change. The same kingdoms that had once been easy targets were no longer weak and divided. Over the previous 2 centuries, rulers across Europe had carefully studied the Viking threat. Every raid, every invasion, and every battle had taught them valuable lessons. Instead of reacting after an attack, they began preparing long before the Vikings ever arrived. England provides one of the clearest examples. After years of conflict, English kings invested heavily in stronger defenses. Coastal watch systems improved, allowing villages to warn one another when ships approached. Fortified towns, known as burhs, became places where local people could quickly gather for protection. Roads were improved so soldiers could move rapidly across the kingdom instead of arriving days too late. The Vikings had once relied on surprise. Now surprise became much harder to achieve. Similar changes took place throughout the rest of Europe. Powerful castles appeared across France and the Holy Roman Empire. Stone walls replaced wooden defenses in many important settlements. River crossings were guarded more carefully, while bridges and fortified ports limited the freedom that Viking longships had once enjoyed. At the same time, European rulers were becoming far more organized. Instead of dozens of small kingdoms constantly fighting each other, larger and more stable states emerged. Kings could collect taxes more efficiently, maintain larger armies, and equip professional soldiers instead of depending entirely on temporary local militias. When Viking fleets appeared, they often faced prepared defenders rather than frightened farmers. The Vikings themselves were changing as well. Many of the men who had once sailed as raiders were now wealthy landowners. Their families had settled permanently in England, Ireland, Normandy, Iceland, and other regions. Farming provided a stable life that endless warfare could not. Trade generated reliable income without risking death at sea. Gradually, the rewards of peaceful life began to outweigh the rewards of raiding. Another transformation proved even more important. For centuries, Norse society had been built around the worship of gods such as Odin, Thor, Freya, and Tyr. Their myths celebrated courage, fate, and honor in battle. But during the 10th and 11th centuries, Christianity spread rapidly throughout Scandinavia. Some rulers accepted the new religion because they genuinely believed its teachings. Others recognized its political advantages. Becoming Christian opened the door to alliances with powerful European kingdoms, increased trade opportunities, and reduced the constant state of conflict between Scandinavian rulers and their neighbors. King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark played a major role in this transformation. During the late 10th century, he officially adopted Christianity and encouraged his people to do the same. Norway followed under kings such as Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, while Sweden gradually embraced the new faith over the following decades. The conversion was not immediate. Many communities continued practicing Old Norse traditions for years, and in some remote regions, both belief systems existed side by side. Archaeologists have discovered graves containing both pagan symbols and Christian crosses, showing that this was a gradual cultural transition rather than an overnight revolution. As Christianity spread, Scandinavian society slowly became more connected to the rest of Europe. Churches replaced pagan temples. Bishops became influential advisors to kings. Written laws began replacing traditions that had previously been passed down through oral storytelling. Education expanded through monasteries, and diplomatic marriages strengthened ties with neighboring kingdoms. The old Viking identity slowly evolved. Young men, who might once have dreamed of earning glory through overseas raids, increasingly found opportunities at home. They served kings, managed farms, traded with foreign merchants, or joined organized armies rather than independent raiding expeditions. Even shipbuilding changed. Longships remained impressive vessels, but larger cargo ships became more common because commerce had become more profitable than conquest. Scandinavian merchants transported timber, fish, iron, wool, and luxury goods across northern Europe, earning fortunes through peaceful exchange instead of violent raids. This shift was not a sign of weakness. It was evidence that Scandinavia itself had become wealthier, more stable, and more politically organized than ever before. Ironically, the Vikings had helped create the very world that no longer needed Vikings. Their exploration had expanded trade. Their settlements had created new cities. Their interactions with Europe had encouraged stronger kingdoms to emerge, and their own success had transformed them from wandering raiders into rulers, merchants, craftsmen, and respected members of an increasingly connected medieval Europe. Still, one final chapter remained. One last great Viking king believed the old age of conquest could return. His name was Harald Hardrada. His ambition would lead to one of the most famous battles in medieval history, and for many historians, it would mark the true end of the Viking Age. Chapter 2, Part 2. the final days of the Viking Age. Among all the Viking rulers who dreamed of restoring the glory of the old days, none was more famous than Harald Hardrada. Born around the year 1015 in Norway, Harald lived a life that seemed almost impossible. Before becoming king, he fought in battles across Eastern Europe, served in the elite Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Empire, and earned a reputation as one of the greatest warriors of his generation. By the middle of the 11th century, Harald ruled Norway and believed his destiny was far from complete. He wanted more than a kingdom. He wanted an empire. His greatest ambition was England. For centuries, England had been one of the richest prizes in Europe. Viking kings had conquered large parts of the island before, and Harald believed he had a legitimate claim to the English throne. In 1066, after learning of political instability following the death of King Edward the Confessor, he gathered a massive fleet and prepared for what would become the last great Viking invasion. Nearly 300 ships crossed the North Sea. Thousands of experienced warriors sailed with Harald, confident that they were continuing the tradition of their ancestors. Many had spent their lives fighting across Europe. Others were young men eager to win glory and wealth. Together, they represented one of the strongest Viking armies assembled in generations. At first, everything seemed to go according to plan. Harald's forces landed in northern England and defeated a local English army at the Battle of Fulford near York. It was an impressive victory that reminded Europe why the Viking name had inspired fear for centuries. Once again, Scandinavian warriors had crossed the sea and defeated an English force on its own soil. But victory often creates confidence, sometimes too much confidence. Only a few days later, Harald's army waited near the village of Stamford Bridge, expecting to receive hostages from the English city of York. Many of his warriors had removed their heavy armor because the weather was unusually warm, and they believed the fighting was over. They were wrong. King Harald Godwinson had marched his English army nearly 200 miles in only a few days, covering an extraordinary distance with remarkable speed. Before the Vikings realized what was happening, the English army appeared on the horizon. The surprise belonged to England this time. According to later accounts, a lone Viking warrior defended the narrow bridge crossing the river Derwent, holding back dozens of English soldiers before finally being killed. Whether every detail of the story is true remains uncertain, but the image has become one of the most enduring legends of the Viking Age. Soon the full battle began. The Vikings fought with the courage that had defined their people for generations, but they were caught unprepared. Without enough armor and facing a determined English army, they struggled to regain the advantage. The fighting was fierce and lasted for hours beneath the late September sky. In the chaos of battle, Harald Hardrada was struck by an arrow that pierced his throat. The great Viking king fell. His death shattered the morale of his warriors. Reinforcements arrived later, but they too were defeated. By the end of the battle, thousands of Vikings lay dead across the fields surrounding Stamford Bridge. The losses were so devastating that only a fraction of the original fleet was needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. Chroniclers later claimed that the invasion had begun with around 300 ships, but fewer than 30 were required for the return journey. While the exact numbers are debated, there is no doubt that the defeat was catastrophic. For many historians, the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25th, 1066, marks the symbolic end of the Viking Age. It was not because every Viking disappeared after that day. Far from it. Scandinavia continued to flourish. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden remained strong kingdoms. Their people continued farming, trading, exploring, building ships, and influencing European politics. What ended was was not a civilization, but an era. The age of great overseas Viking raids had come to a close. Europe had changed. Scandinavia had changed. The world no longer rewarded small fleets of independent warriors in the same way it had during the 8th and 9th centuries. Instead, power belonged to organized kingdoms, permanent armies, fortified cities, and growing international trade. The descendants of the Vikings adapted remarkably well. They became kings, merchants, sailors, craftsmen, explorers, and citizens of thriving medieval societies. Norse blood continued to flow through generations of people across northern Europe. Their language influenced English. Their place names still appear on maps throughout Britain. Their shipbuilding techniques inspired future generations of sailors. Their stories, preserved in the Icelandic sagas, survived long after the last Viking expedition had ended. In many ways, the Vikings never truly vanished. They simply became part of the world they had helped create. Conclusion. When people ask what happened to the Vikings, they often imagine a dramatic ending. They picture one final battle, one great defeat, or a mysterious event that caused an entire civilization to disappear overnight. History tells a different story. The Vikings were not wiped out by a single enemy. They were not driven into extinction, nor did they simply vanish from the face of the earth. Their story ended not because they were destroyed, but because they changed. The world that had once allowed Viking raids to flourish was no longer the same. Europe became stronger, kingdoms became more organized, castles protected vulnerable towns, and professional armies replaced scattered local defenders. At the same time, Scandinavia itself was transforming. Christianity spread throughout the region, trade became more profitable than raiding, and stable kingdoms replaced the small rival chiefdoms of the past. The qualities that had once made the Vikings legendary did not disappear. Their courage remained. Their remarkable skills as sailors continued to shape Northern Europe. Their spirit of exploration inspired future generations. Their descendants carried their traditions into a new age. Today, the legacy of the Vikings can still be found across the world. Their influence survives in the English language, in the names of countless towns and villages, in archaeological discoveries buried beneath the soil of Europe, and in the ancient sagas that continue to fascinate historians and readers alike. Modern DNA studies have also revealed just how widely Viking families settled, leaving traces of their ancestry far beyond Scandinavia. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of their story. The Vikings did not truly disappear. The warriors who once sailed across stormy seas eventually became farmers, merchants, kings, explorers, craftsmen, and ordinary families. Their longships no longer appear on the horizon, but their achievements continue to echo through history more than 1,000 years later. From the frozen fjords of Norway to the shores of North America, from the rivers of Eastern Europe to the kingdoms of England, the Viking Age changed the course of history in ways that are still visible today. Their era came to an end. Their people did not. And perhaps that is the real truth about the disappearance of the Vikings. It was never the end of a people. It was the beginning of their transformation into the nations and cultures that still exist today. The age of the Vikings is over, but their story will never truly fade. It lives on in history, in legend, and in the memory of a world they helped shape.